Communism is a strong word, but what does it mean? And is Kamala Harris worthy of that charge? Is the Harris-Walz campaign of joy genuine? Are the polls believable? And do conservatives and Republicans have reason to despair? Well, we've got a loaded show for you today. Welcome to episode 46. I am Blake Watson, and this is We the Free. One of the best ways you can help our show, other than by sharing today's episode, is by picking up some We the Free merch at wethefreeshow.com. You can be the Salt and Light you were meant to be by wearing the Salt and Light shirt, or by sipping your coffee from the Salt and Light mug. Or you can sport the God Bless America shirt and the We the Free crest tee. We've even got stickers and a Smells Like Freedom candle, so check out our merch today at wethefreeshow.com. We are 74 days away from what is literally going to be the most consequential election in American history. And yes, I know that we said that the last time and the time before that, and I can't say we've been wrong in saying that. The consequences of another Clinton administration would have been terrible. And just look at what 4 years of Biden and Harris has done to not only America, but the entire world. Each of these elections have had drastic consequences, whereas prior to, let's say, 2008, we wouldn't really make such a dramatic claim. And that's because we're at an ideological, political, spiritual, moral impasse. Historically, America is at a critical juncture. The turn we take in November will literally determine the course to either our own destruction or a reset of the coordinates to return to our former glory. The good old days of bipartisan debate over, taxes and clean air are a bygone era, because now we're fighting over issues of life and death, good and evil, morality and immorality. And the nomenclatures are perhaps more apt than ever: liberalism and conservatism. America's path has reached an end where we must turn either to the left or to the right. There is no path forward. There is no compromise. There is no agreeing to disagree. There is no getting along to go along. The interdimensionality of the spiritual and physical worlds has reached a crux in the United States. Good and evil do not intertwine, and many nations in history have been taken by the latter. The fight in America is indeed a spiritual one, which must be won, and this is only possible by defeating all that threatens and mocks and opposes the Almighty Creator our forefathers inscribed so many years ago. So how do we win? How does America win? Well, we've been talking about it for a year now on this show. There's not a single or simple answer. It's complicated, and it's going to take hard work and concerted effort on behalf of millions of us. It's even going to take debate and serious conversation amongst our own ranks. The brunt of the work is spiritual. The church in America must be reformed before we can make a real difference in the world. But that's going to take years and years, maybe a generation. But in the immediate future, there's something political to be done. Why must we fight like we're 10 points down? According to Pew Research, the political composition of the United States shows a nearly even split between Democrats and Republicans, with a significant portion identifying as independent. That doesn't mean the independent party with a capital I, but points to voters who are not official party members with the DNC or the GOP. About 33% of registered voters align with the Democrat Party, while 32% identify with the Republican Party. If you're doing the math, that shows us that nearly 35% of Americans consider themselves independent. We're practically divided into thirds, but independent voters will largely align themselves with one side or the other, especially in such polarizing times with such desperate positions. Now, what does that tell you? This election will be decided by independent voters. Independent doesn't necessarily mean politically moderate, though. It simply refers to those who are not registered party members for either the Democrats or the Republicans. And that's largely due to which state you live in. For example, in Tennessee, I'm not required to register with the Republican Party in order to cast a vote for the Republican nominee. I can go to the ballot this November and vote for whomever I please. But that's not the case in every state. Independent describes someone who is not a member of the DNC or the GOP. So that doesn't mean an independent voter is politically moderate. Liberal and conservative politicians are mostly disgusted with so-called moderate Republicans or Democrats. And outside of Congress, it's hard to tell from the Pew Research how many Americans would say they're politically moderate. Well, that's where Gallup comes in. This data from just a couple months ago, Americans' ideological self-identification on social issues, is almost an exact duplicate of the political breakdown with some slight distinctions. As of June 2024, liberalism constitutes 33% of Americans, while conservatism and conservatives and moderates each comprise 32%, respectively, of the ideological landscape. Now look at this. Don't miss this. While the first chart demonstrates the ideological divide on social issues, like abortion, immigration, racial issues, etc., this second chart demonstrates the ideological self-identification on economic issues. That top line demonstrating the majority of Americans at 39% are conservatives. Moderates make up the second largest group at 35%, and liberals make up the smallest portion of Americans at 23%. So I'll say it again, only putting all this together. Independents and moderates will decide this election. Let's say conservatives can persuade moderates to vote for their preferred candidate in this election. That means 7 out of 10 voters would be voting Republican in November. Liberals only make up roughly 30% of the political and ideological populace in America. One problem that we have is participation, though. Whether it is loss of faith in the system or a tortoise and the hare kind of situation, conservatives have not been participating like they should. So there needs to be a conversation about getting as many people out to vote as possible. I know Charlie Kirk is leading an effort in battleground states to chase down ballots, and we need that as well. But I think the real secret to this election are the independent and moderate voters. Conservatives and Republicans aren't going anywhere. Liberals and Democrats certainly aren't going anywhere either. It's the independents and moderates who must be persuaded. Now stick with me. We've got a lot to go through, and it's really important. I've been telling you for months and months that Donald Trump is the only candidate, the only one, through primary season and all, who has been campaigning for the middle. Prime examples include his positions on abortion, IVF, Ukraine and Russia, Israel and Iran, China, and other foreign policy issues. On all of this, he's been solidly moderate. Just think about it. Liberals want unfettered, unbridled abortion, up until the moment of birth and in some cases after birth. Conservatives want 0 baby murders, no matter what. Trump wants states to make their own decisions on the issue. That's a moderate decision. In vitro fertilization, same response. Liberals want IVF so that non-heterosexual persons that are in some kind of legal union together can have semi-biological children. Conservatives don't want babies frozen on ice and ultimately destroyed. Trump wants to preserve IVF because he wants more families to have more children. That's a moderate position. Liberals want to give Ukraine all the money in the world to make their defense against Russia. Conservatives don't want to give Ukraine a dime because they're corrupt, and we want other NATO countries to exhibit some kind of fair share. Trump wants to end the conflict tomorrow so we can stop bleeding money, and Vladimir kicks it back in the Kremlin. That's a moderate position. Liberals want Israel to cease firing, and they want a two-state solution. Conservatives want Israel to defend herself and utterly defeat her enemies, and for the head of the Iranian snake to be removed. Trump wants Israel to finish the job and for America to support her to that extent, and he'll reuse economic pressure to shrivel Iran into submission. That's relatively moderate to create peace in the Middle East. I could keep going, but I think you get the point. Trump has been the only candidate campaigning in the middle. Now, the distinction from Obama's 2008 campaign was that Obama didn't make any of his policy positions really clear, and he stood in the middle of the road. Trump has made his policies clear, and I, for one, believe that this clarity will appeal to more moderates and independents than we've seen possibly ever. Now, obviously, there's one candidate who's not making any of her policies clear, at least in 2024. Well, let me be more specific. In August of 2024, she's not talking about policy at all. Why? Because she also knows that this election is about appealing to the moderates and independents. And with this sizable swing group, her policies are unpopular. But here's the massive problem and the foremost issue that conservatives, Christians, Republicans, and the Trump-Vance campaign must address. According to Brent Bozell at the Media Research Center, large majorities of registered Democrats and independents who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, exactly those who would be expected to support Vice President Harris in this year's contest, are mostly in the dark about many of the controversial and radical positions Harris has taken. In other words, they're almost entirely unaware of the Harris-Walz radicalism. They surveyed 1,200 voters. There were 800 Democrats and 400 independents. Take a look at the stunning results. 86% of them are unaware that Harris would consider allowing death row inmates to vote. 81% have no clue that she supported the elimination of private health insurance. 78% of Democrat and independent voters are unaware that Harris promoted a fund to bail out violent protesters during the BLM riots of 2020, which we talked about last week in the Minnesota Freedom Fund. 77% don't know that she supported abolishing ICE. 75% did not even realize that she was named the most liberal senator in 2019. 74% were unaware that Harris said it should not be considered a crime. Hello, 74% were unaware that Harris said it should not be considered a crime to enter the U.S. illegally. 73% didn't know she co-sponsored the Green New Deal. 72% are not aware that she never visited a conflict zone on the border. 71% are clueless to the fact that she supported defunding the police. And finally, 71% are unaware that Harris supported reparations payments to atone for slavery in the United States. When these voters were asked where they got most of their news, what do you think they said? ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and MSNBC. In fact, the MRC, the Media Research Center, who conducted this research, scoured those news outlets from July 21st to August 10th, since Harris undemocratically became the Democrat candidate, and they found that 8 out of 10 of those issues received zero attention. Zero. While the other 2 issues received minor coverage. Well, that obviously means the Praetorian Guard media, as Mark Levin calls them, they're covering for Kamala and Walz. The question is this working? How well is this working? Is this enough to get them across the finish line in November? Because it worked in 2020. Biden was able to sit in his basement and not allow the world to see his already declining cognition. The lamestream media covered for him. The election was truly Trump versus the Praetorian Guard media. And they were able to smear him enough and often enough and cover up and deflect and lie about any negativity surrounding Joe Biden. Rumors of corruption, Hunter's laptop, horrific policy agendas, etc., his record. And you know what happened? Is that strategy going to be successful in 2024? I mean, thanks to them, right now, Kamala doesn't have to answer any questions. She doesn't have to answer for the current state of the country. She doesn't have to answer for her record as a senator, an attorney general, or a prosecutor. She doesn't have to explain any of her positions. She won't be called out for her lies and her apparent 180-degree policy turns. As I've been saying for a month, their campaign strategy is lying. And since we don't have a free press, the entity inscribed in the Constitution for pressing these issues doesn't exist anymore. Over the last few weeks, I've been pleading with conservatives and Republicans not to buy the Harris-Walz hype. Yet, conservatives and Republicans in the like are criticizing the Trump campaign right now. They're scared. They're being defeatist. They're believing all the polls and headlines pointing to and predicting a Trumpian catastrophe, that all hope is lost, that it's all over, even though it's August 22nd. Folks, please, when you understand the history of propaganda and how the media operate in rotting regimes, you would understand that the hype is manufactured to disparage you, to disparage the opposition, to bolster their base and persuade the moderate allegiance. I'll explain it all today. But first, let's take a look at some polling. There are 2 kinds of polling. Accurate and responsible polling to reveal the truth, whether we like it or not, or inaccurate and weighted polling for political propaganda. In other words, some polls are honestly telling the truth with no agenda attached, and other polls are dishonestly fudging the numbers to push a political agenda. That said, you cannot and must not draw your conclusions by the headlines of polling. You have to drill into the data and the sampling data, see who they've talked to in order to determine reality. Well, 1 week ago, Rasmussen, the most accurate polling outlet in the 2016 election, polled nearly 2,000 American voters at a sampling rate of D+2. What is D+2? That means there was an oversampling of Democrats to Republican voters by 2%. So there's 2% more Democrats in that 2,000. So the party demographics were 35% Democrats, 33% Republican, and 32% Independent, which is a fair sampling minus that oversampling of D+2. Listen very carefully to the results. and I'll put them on screen for you to see. If the 2024 candidates for president were Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Cornel West, Jill Stein, and Chase Oliver, who would you vote for? Trump leads Harris by 4%, 48 to 44. He leads Harris with men by 5%, 48 to 43. Believe it or not, Trump leads Harris with women by 2%, 47 to 45. He's behind with 18 to 39-year-olds by 1%, 43 to 44. He leads with 40 to 65 and up by about 4%. Trump leads with white voters by 11%, 52 to 41. He's way behind with black voters. Harris leads 65 to 27. Trump is leading Harris with Hispanic voters by 6%, 47 to 41. Obviously, Harris leads with Democrats and Trump with Republicans, but listen to this. Trump is leading with non-affiliated voters by 9 points, 48 to 39. Now here's what we need to talk about. The participants were asked to categorize themselves as conservative, moderate, or liberal, and who they supported in that mock election. Here's what they said. 74% of conservatives are voting for Donald Trump. 85% of liberals are voting for Kamala Harris, but 55% of moderates are supporting Harris. This is the most accurate poll that I've seen. The sampling group was almost split exactly to the political and ideological makeup of the country, which we talked about earlier, and it's even weighted more so for Democrats, D+2. A few takeaways from this that are actually critically important. Number one, the race is closer than you think, but Trump is leading by a slim margin. Secondly, Trump has made shocking gains among the Hispanic community, which shows you how important the immigration issue is. Third, that only 3/4 of conservatives are supporting Trump. 3/4. And finally, number 4, while independents are on Trump's side, the majority of moderates are on Harris's side. Freebies. Don't let the paint dry. I'm telling you all of this for a reason. We've got a real fight on our hands. I mean, that's no surprise to you. But everything we've covered so far makes it clear what the campaign strategy should be. If someone could get this list to the Trump-Vance campaign, I would greatly appreciate it. Okay? Here are the 4 winning strategy points from the Watson Institute of Political Education. Number 1, we must shore up unanimous conservative support. Whatever it takes to unify the Republican conservative ticket, that's what must be done. I understand that we have rhinos and never-Trumpers, but they surely don't comprise 25% of the conservative voting bloc. My take is that this wayward group are the old-fashioned Bush types who are turned off by your unpresidential attitude or persona. Either show them that that doesn't matter, or show them that you can behave like a gentleman. Second, appeal to the freer-thinking liberals and moderates. If Rasmussen is correct, and I believe they are, you have a minimum opportunity to persuade a victorious amount of moderates with the help of even some liberals. Don't move on the social issues at this point, but drill into the economic issues. I often think about the constant refrain of my U.S. history teacher, Mr. Jones, who said the same phrase every single chapter: money makes the world go round. The bottom line is people care about their financial welfare. They care about that financial stability and security. They care about taking care of their families. The Gallup poll research shows us this, but on a related note, but a separate strategy, number 3, we must show the world who they are. Your most effective chance at capturing the minority of defective so-called liberals, probably your old school Democrats, and the majority of the moderate and independent voters is in defining Kamala Harris and Tim Walz for who they really are. Don't let the media win this game. Show the people their record. Play the clips. Be prepared to attack those points in the debates. Be prepared to refute their lies in this respect at the debates. Start dumping millions of ad dollars to reveal who they are. Because according to the MRC, moderates, independents, and liberals are lost in the dark on it. And finally, number 4, paint the clearest distinction. Contrast America pre-COVID to America post-Biden-Harris. Contrast her vision to yours. Make it black and white. Make it painfully obvious that the Trump-Vance White House is the best thing for the future of not only America, but the world. Shore up conservative support, capture undecideds, the moderates and the freer thinking liberals, define Harris-Walz, and illustrate the contrast historically and politically. In addition to these 4 campaign necessities, there must be an effort to mobilize voters who have been inactive for whatever reason, who have lost faith in the electoral system, or who are convinced that the election is over. Now, many have been criticizing Trump for what seems like inactivity, as if he's not doing enough. Some are saying that he's been totally shaken up by the assassination attempt. That's why he's not doing so many rallies. That's why he's standing behind bulletproof glass now. Why aren't they doing the things that we just talked about? What is going on? Well, it's not that they're doing nothing. I mean, Donald Trump has a lot of things going on right now. He's been campaigning for 2 years, for goodness sake. J.D. Vance has been doing a great job on just about every single cable news and network news channel there is. So here's my read on the situation. This is the calm before the storm. Why is there such a calm from Trump? Perhaps he's utilizing the strategy of allowing Harris and Walz to saturate the political space because he's allowing them enough rope to, you know what? In other words, like Napoleon once said, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. The thing is, though, we know the media is giving them billions and billions of dollars in ads and protection for free. No one is there to point out the mistakes, the lying, the ridiculous policy, the atrocious record, etc. If Trump and Vance aren't outputting equal noise to define them for who they really are, if they're not illustrating and making obvious the Trump-Vance distinction, who is? Last month, when Harris was undemocratically selected by the Democrat elites, I said that she wouldn't be able to effectively distance herself from her own policies and failed record. But this information evolves that idea. If conservatives, Republicans, and other sensible people don't point it out, then the seemingly impossible becomes possible. However, there is a surprising schism forming. And it makes sense, but I'm honestly shocked by it. I didn't think it would happen because Democrats are 99% aligned with each other and hardly anyone ever breaks rank. I figured that all that they would try to do is, smile and wave their way into the White House while the lamestream media shields them from questioning and petitioning. But as it turns out, that's not a winning strategy. The lack of genuine momentum is proving that. That's why they're using artificial intelligence to beef up the crowds or to add a crowd where there isn't one in videos and pictures. That's why they're doing small venues. That's why they're using pipe and drape to section off empty sections of seating. That's why they're stealing some of the Trump-Vance policy positions, like no tax on tips. That's why they've hired a legal team that is 10 times larger than Biden's in 2020. It's all propaganda, which we'll come back to in a moment, but the losing basement strategy has also been evidenced by the fact that Harris is officially beginning to sever herself from her boss. She has to do this. And you know, there are actually liberals who believe that Biden stepped aside nobly and gracefully, a real George Washington type of moment. But it's actually something like what happened in 44 BC, when a group of Roman senators, concerned with the power and authority of their leader, Julius Caesar, conspired to assassinate him, to take him out. Well, on the 15th of March, nearly 60 people ambushed Caesar in the theater of Pompeii, stabbing him 23 times. His murder on the Ides of March. Shakespeare popularized a phrase in his play about Julius Caesar, beware the Ides of March, which was a warning of betrayal and doom given to Caesar by this prophetic soothsayer. In real life, however, his murder set off a series of civil conflicts and ultimately led to the fall of the Republic. So here you're witnessing something similar with the Democratic leadership. Kamala Harris and others represent the gang of assassins. Biden is Julius Caesar and Nancy Pelosi is the soothsayer. Only they're not using swords and daggers. They're using microphones. The USA Today writes, Democrats are wasting no time putting President Joe Biden out to pasture. The Democratic National Convention, which kicked off Monday in Chicago, highlighted the Democrats' outgoing party leader on the first night of the nominating confab. And they couldn't even let Biden speak during prime time when most viewers are watching. He didn't take the stage until nearly an hour later than scheduled. By scheduling Biden on the first night of the convention, Democrats can conveniently put the past behind them and continue their newfound love affair with Harris and her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. In their reshuffling post Biden's dropping out, convention organizers and party bosses have done everything in their power to paint the president as a figure of the past. And by slotting him on opening night, they created as much distance between Harris and Biden as they possibly can. Biden's quick exit could indicate a couple of things, or perhaps a mix of both. One, Biden is holding on to some deserved bitterness about how those he thought were his friends in the party ditched him in the end, including Obama and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Second, Harris realizes that Biden has become politically radioactive and wants to create as much separation between the two as she can, given they are still running the country together, purportedly. As equally obvious and as similarly shanking are Kamala's recent policy flips. For Harris to come out and make policy claims, which are the complete opposite of the Biden-Harris policies, is another dagger in Biden-Caesar. Yes, it's also a political pivot for electoral success, and it proves what I'm saying about moderate voters, but you're witnessing a severance that many of us thought impossible. So one of the main and what will surely be one of the most important, if not the most important, political issues is that of the economy. There's no mistake that the current state of the economy is Biden and Harris's fault. Their wretched and, quite frankly, wicked economic policies have wrecked the majority of Americans, perhaps on purpose. It doesn't matter what Don Lemon says. You remove the reality of COVID from the end of Trump's presidency, and he's the greatest economic president in recent American history. Look at 2016 to the first quarter of 2020 and compare it to 2021 to now. That's all the data you need. Look at the 8% inflation that we had just a couple years ago. Look at the record gasoline prices at $5 a gallon. Look at the exorbitantly higher costs of everything Look at mortgage rates, which have nearly quadrupled. More importantly, though, average everyday Americans can feel the difference. And make no mistake, the financial tension that you feel now is because of the economic policy of your sitting president and vice president. 100%. But don't worry, everyone. Kamala Harris, now that she's running to be in charge, she has a new plan. It's completely new and revolutionary. Here's the New York Post explaining it. Vice President Kamala Harris on Friday unveiled the economic policies she would enact in her first 100 days in office, and it comes with a whopping estimated $1.7 trillion in handouts, as well as government price controls on groceries amid ravaging Biden-Harris administration inflation. Her economic plan includes measures to dole out $25,000 to help first-time homeowners with their down payments and give up to $6,000 tax breaks for lower and middle-income families who have a child in their first year of life. The housing subsidies alone are absolutely inflationary and would push a $2 trillion deficit even higher. Brian Riedel, a senior economic fellow at the Manhattan Institute, told the Post, referring to the already projected budget shortfall of 2024. Writing people large checks and enforcing price controls is a recipe for expanding demand and shrinking supply, creating shortages and necessitating rationing. This is very reckless to be adding this type of debt to our already existing mountain of debt. Joel Griffith, an economic research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, told the Post in reference to the rising national deficit that currently sits at $34 trillion and is expected to reach $50 trillion by 2034. Harris's agenda is missing details on how her proposed tax subsidies and expansions in federal programs would be paid for, risking a worsening debt trajectory, the foundation said in an analysis. The combined cost of the proposals would likely exceed $2 trillion over 10 years, putting upward pressure on inflation to the extent they are deficit financed and leading to a further prolonging of the Federal Reserve's high interest rate stance. Harris's tax agenda is problematic for three major reasons. It would further entrench social policy and spending into the tax code. It would subsidize home buyers rather than address supply constraints. And it does not specify sufficient offsets to pay for the subsidies, worsening an unsustainable debt trajectory, the Tax Foundation said. I'm quoting extensively from this article because it hits just about everything. But if you're keeping up, Harris plans to reduce grocery costs by banning price gouging or stopping sellers from pricing their products excessively. She promised to build 3 million new homes in 4 years and offered $25,000 vouchers for first-time home buyers. She wants to expand the child tax credit to $6,000, and she wants to cancel medical debt, cap insulin costs at $35 and more. And that's without mentioning anything thus far about energy policy, which, as we've discussed numerous times on this show, the Biden-Harris energy policy is the #1 source of our economic woes. E.J. Antony, a public finance economist at the Heritage Foundation, told the Post that the Harris agenda is even worse than the Biden agenda. It means more spending, more borrowing, and more money printing to pay for it all. The Trump campaign has especially taken issue with her price control policies, calling them communist and comparing her proposals to those of authoritarian leaders in Venezuela and Cuba. When the government comes in and takes over food production and sets prices, that inevitably leads to food shortages and even famines, economist Kevin Hassett said in a Trump campaign press call. Harris blamed the high grocery store prices on the supply chain disruptions during the pandemic. But economist Stephen Moore said the average margin for a grocery store or 7-Eleven selling food is between 2 and 3 percentage points, predicting that many of them will go out of business with price controls. Author and contributor to the Wall Street Journal Helen Raleigh posted on X, Government-imposed price control is a terrible idea because it makes the economy worse by causing shortages. Everyone who survived socialism, communism knows this. If the store shelves are empty, it doesn't matter how low the government claims the price of bread is. In other words, on this particular policy, history didn't begin 4 years ago. We've been there and done that and bought the t-shirt numerous times the world over, even here in America. And we'll talk about some of those in a moment. But first, I want to show you how insanely stupid or incredibly evil this policy is. Are you ready? This is what would happen, and hat tip to Robert Sterling on X. The first thing that would happen, the government decrees by executive order or congressional law that grocers, sellers, and producers can't raise their prices above whatever threshold. Secondly, all of these stores, which already operate on slim margins, like we're talking 1% to 2%, maybe 3%, either can't survive or can only barely survive. Third, mom and pop shops start to go under. Even national stores in lower income areas struggle to pay their employees, their bills for utilities, etc. And even the national sales chains start closing locations because they become like a financial liability. Fourth, the profits then for producers, food producers, starts to plummet. Next, since grocery store chains can no longer compete on prices, they'll start to sell more non-food items, and they start competing with things like payment plans. Instead of paying now, you can pay monthly payments, for example. Then, the smaller food producers who sell through distribution companies because they're not big enough to distribute themselves, they begin to shut down. That inevitably leads to rising costs for supply chains. Then supply chains begin shutting down locations everywhere. Then food lines begin forming in every city. Then the government begins to gobble up these closed supply chains and food production factories. Then they further control prices in production, and they do a terrible job at it. And then because of that, they issue ration cards to control both supply and demand. And then finally, step 13, unlucky 13, there's a mass starvation and economic collapse. Now, how do we know this? Because it happened with Ukraine in the 30s, as millions of Ukrainians starved to death. It happened with China in the 60s, where tens of millions starved to death. It happened in Cambodia in the 70s, where 1 million people starved to death. In the 80s, it was the Ethiopians, where 1 million people starved to death. In the 90s, it was about 1 million North Koreans who starved to death. Right now, it's in Venezuela, where millions are facing malnutrition and have fled the country due to the dire conditions. In case you're not keeping a running total here, that's more than 20 million people just in the last century who have starved to death. And for what reason? Is it because Ukrainians didn't know how to cook? Is it because the Chinese faced drought? Is it because Cambodians lacked the distribution? No, it's the same reason in every single one of these gruesome situations. Are you listening? It's communism. You know what Karl Marx hated? Perhaps more than he hated capitalists. The socialists. Why? Because socialism is half-hearted communism. It falls short of the truly revolutionary system of governance. With socialism, the government owns and operates the major industries and resources, but people can still own personal property and small businesses. The main focus with socialism is universal healthcare and education and housing. All of these through government programs. With communism, there is no private ownership of any kind. You don't own anything. Socialist societies can be democratic somewhat. Communist societies are completely autocratic. And here's the part that Merriam-Webster leaves out if you try to look up definitions to these words. Socialism is bloodless authoritarianism. Communism is bloody totalitarianism. The historians and political theorists and your college professors always leave out the spiritual component to this subject. That man is inherently evil, and that when given absolute power and authority, the dark specter enters the room. Lord Acton wrote in 1887 that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he's right, because man is fallen. Socialism seems like a great idea on paper, until sin enters the picture. It's also deeply un-American because it's a massive infringement on personal liberty. And I can hear some ignorant and uneducated Christians right now saying that the Bible commends socialism. Oh, well then please show me where it says that. Do you mean in the book of Acts, where they lived as one community for about 2 weeks? And then as soon as the Jews came after them, it was over faster than you could blink. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, I don't think so. My point here is this. Let's sit aside the demonic fantasies and lunatic lifestyle of Karl Marx, and let's assume that there was goodwill in his intention to create a classless society where everyone was completely, absolutely equal in every way. So he outlined the system and process to accomplish said system through force, of course. Well, if you're a power-hungry maniac, you're foaming at the mouth to plug in the red machine. Because if there's one thing that happens every time with communism, the dictator, the autocrat, the oligarchs become a super, uber wealthy upper class. Every single time. It never becomes a classless society. It always becomes where you have one uber wealthy class. The middle class is entirely obliterated, eliminated, and everyone else becomes the poor and penniless lower class. Every single time. It's pure and undefiled evil. You know, another central aspect of communism is utopian propaganda. These leaders cannot possibly describe in plain German or Russian, Mandarin, etc., that their governmental plan is one of consolidating power and wealth to the top 0.01%. No, nobody would go for that. Instead, let's paint a beautiful picture of a glorious future where we're all happy and filled with joy. Here, I'll show you. This is a poster from Nazi Germany. You see a German family with the text Kraft durch Freude, which means strength through joy. Kraft durch Freude, or KDF, was a state-controlled leisure organization who organized recreational activities, cultural programs, and affordable vacations. It was a key part of the Nazi strategy to control the daily lives of citizens and promote loyalty to the regime. They aimed to bring people together through these things to foster a sense of community and national pride, but the activities were meant to ensure that even in their free time, Germans were exposed to Nazi ideology. This poster is just a tiny example, but the KDF organized concerts and theater performances, all of which propagated Nazi themes. They provided vacations and cruises. They built holiday resorts Just think of the handouts. All of this in order to prove to them that the Nazi regime was improving their lives. KDF was responsible for the Volkswagen, or the people's car. In other words, this was social control, the illusion of happiness and joy for the subtle purpose of indoctrinating Germans with Nazi ideology. Kraft durch Freude means strength through joy. And oh yeah, the Nazis would go on to murder millions and millions of people and set off an entire world war in the 30s and 40s. Then there's this poster from the Soviet Union depicting the communist leader Joseph Stalin. The text across the bottom exclaims, "Beloved Stalin is the people's happiness." Under Stalin's totalitarian rule, the Soviets used propaganda to depict a joyful, harmonious society. The media and cultural productions often portrayed workers and farmers and soldiers, everyday people, in states of exuberance and fulfillment, celebrating collective victories in agriculture, industry, or warfare. Propaganda like this was intended to convince citizens that the communist system provided happiness and prosperity. You could say joy, despite the widespread poverty, repression, and fear. So festivals, parades, and mass gatherings were orchestrated to reinforce this narrative, focusing on themes of collective joy, while glossing over the harsh realities of life under Stalin. And oh yeah, tens of millions would be killed through mass murder, forced labor, and famine under the Soviet Union in the 1920s. How's about this one from the Chinese Cultural Revolution? This poster, and I kid you not, is titled, "Mao's Words Bring Joy." I mean, look at how joyous they are. The man in front is holding a sign that says in Mandarin some of Mao's recent quotes at the time, "Grasp the revolution, promote production, promote work, and promote war preparedness." But you can see how joyous the people are. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao's regime heavily emphasized joy and exuberance and state-sponsored propaganda. Posters and films and performances often depicted smiling citizens joyfully participating in collective labor and revolutionary activities. Listen, the idea was to equate happiness and joy with loyalty to the Communist Party and participation in the revolution. Public displays of joy became a way to demonstrate allegiance, and those who did not participate enthusiastically risked being labeled counter-revolutionaries. And, nearly 50 million Chinese citizens, 50 million, starved to death or died from persecution, prison labor, and mass execution in the 1960s. Now there you have just 3 prime examples of propagandistic indoctrination to bamboozle the masses into collectively entering the gas chambers or the rice fields or what have you. Joy. That's what they were promised. The opposite is what they were given. And why? Because it was all a lie. What I'm about to show you is not from the 60s or the 20s or the 30s. Actually, they're all from the last couple weeks. The New York Times wrote, "Harris used to worry about laughing. Now, joy is fueling her campaign." Vanity Fair, "Sweet emotion, how the Harris-Walz ticket wields joy against Donald Trump." Salon, "Bringing back the joy. Kamala Harris rally blows away J.D. Vance's weird appearance across town." The Washington Post, "Harris and Walz seize on joyful message in contrast to darker Trump theme." The Associated Press, "Harris is pushing joy. Trump paints a darker picture. Will mismatched moods matter?" The New York Times, Harris, Walz, and Democrats, joyful campaign. CBS, Alex Wagner on watching Kamala Harris embrace her own joy while Trump fails to define her. The Guardian, Democrats' joy is unconfined as Harris and Walz take upbeat message on tour. NPR, Harris and Walz reintroduced joy to Democrats their first week on the campaign trail. You know, Kamala Harris's father, Donald Harris, was a Jamaican-born economist and professor who taught at Stanford University. He was also a Marxist. He focused his work on Marxist economics and critiques of capitalism. He wrote about social justice and economic inequality, of course, from the Marxist worldview. So guess what? Kamala's a chip off the old block. The Kamala apple doesn't fall far from the Harris tree. She's cut from daddy's cloth. Should I keep going? Okay, I will. This catchphrase of hers, what can be, unburdened by what has been. In Marxism, the idea is to overcome the limitations imposed by current conditions, which are a product of past social and economic structures, to then realize an equitable society. Marxism is to seek revolution. Break free from the chains of oppression and exploitation. Create a new order. Marx said, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. Kamala's version of that is what can be, unburdened by what has been. Communism. It's quite clear the woman is a born and bred Marxist, a socialist on the track or the descent to communism. But the labels are not sticking. And to be honest, I'm not totally sure the reason. Perhaps it's because the media are being so effective at reintroducing her and the relentless drumbeat of state-sponsored propaganda. The Pavlov effect, that every time you think of Kamala, you think of joy. Maybe it's because Marxism and communism are terms too distant from Americans today. It's been too long since America confronted Marxism, communism. For Latin Americans, it's not that distant. Perhaps that's why their numbers are increasingly going to Trump. Nevertheless, the nicknames are flying all over the place. Commie Kamala, Comrade Kamala, you name it. But none of them are sticking or are making any difference. So what's the point? I think it's a mistake to try to use the nomenclature of communism to dissuade voters, at least the moderates and independents, from supporting Harris. It's too complex and historical. I mean, you all are smart cookies. But here we are 50 minutes into a conversation about a political and economic philosophy born in the 19th century Germany. You see what I mean? You think people have been properly educated to even know what we've been discussing? Of course not. Otherwise, Harris and Walz wouldn't bother. So the problem is that there's nothing in modern vernacular to replace it. There's not a name we can put on it. The average voter, the ones that are in the middle that we should be pursuing, wouldn't have a clue about the Marxist, communist charges thrown at Harris. They won't know that what they're hearing is socialism and that the centralized enforcement of it is communism. Harris and Walz are plainly and even outspokenly socialist economically. They're publicly egalitarians, they're privately communist. But how do we expose this without losing interest? Without it just going over people's heads? Well, I don't mean to sound demeaning, but we can't use language or history that people don't understand. You have to put it in the realest terms to them. I gave you somewhat of an example earlier with all of the pricing regulations, but the point is you have to put the problem in people's front yard. It has to proverbially knock on their front door. If we resort to historical labels and facts, that's unfortunately too abstract to the miseducated and the indoctrinated. I know that that's frustrating, but that's the way that it is in 2024. So what do we have to do? We've got to shore up conservative support. We need 100% of conservatives and Republicans supporting Trump and Vance. We have to appeal to freer thinking liberals and moderates in some of the ways that I've outlined today. We must show the world who Harris and Walz really are, and that's not by pointing our fingers and shouting communist. Make it simple, but real for your neighbor. Tell them what's going to happen. Paint the most distinct picture possible. This is what change will look like in the United States and the world. And finally, we've got to mobilize as many people as possible to show up and vote. Pray, pray, pray all day and every day, but put some legs on those prayers and let's do this. Well, that's going to do it for me. What'll it be next time? We'll see. For now, go and be the salt and light you are meant to be, and we'll see you next time on We the Free. Thanks for watching today. Listen, I want to make sure you stay informed on the news and the biblical response to it, so do yourself and us a favor and hit the subscribe button before you go. And then we would love for you to go check out wethefreeshow.com to grab yourself some merch to spread the word about We the Free. And we're also going to put a video on screen that we think you'll like. Now, go and be that salt and light, and we'll see you next time.